Here we go. Well, I think it's actually time to start. So we are going to get started. We've got our panelists here, so we are ready to go. Just as an introduction, my name is Fred Larson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the National Institute of Social Sciences. We will tell more about us a little bit later. You're on a Zoom webinar. I'm sure many of you have done way too many of these over the last 18 months, but so you probably know what's going on, but I'll run it down very quickly. You are going to be on mute by default. You do have the ability to submit questions to the panelists as we go forward using the Q&A function, which should be in your control bar for the Zoom. Also, to the extent you need to leave early or weren't able to join, we are recording this forum and we will post the recording in a nicely edited form on the web within a couple of days after the event. So let's get started. We are the National Institute of Social Sciences. We are a congressionally chartered, not-for-profit association of citizens who seek to understand and improve the world through the study and discussion of vital societal issues. I can think of no more vital societal issue than healthcare, and certainly not in the context of the last year or so. So I'm really excited. Today we've got two terrific panelists. I think they're going to really give us an excellent tennis match of ideas, shall we say, batting the ball back and forth and giving their different perspectives. Chris Austin is currently CEO partner at Flagship Pioneering. That is a relatively new post for him. He joins Flagship Pioneering from the National Institutes of Health, where for the last decade or so, he was the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which is highly relevant, and I'll have him explain why. Also as well, with us we have Paul Edward Farmer. Many of you National Institute groupies know Paul because we gave him our Gold Honor Medal in the year 2019 for his outstanding contributions to society. He still is doing outstanding contributions to society. He chairs the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard, but also he's the co-founder and chief strategist at Partners in Health, which has extreme relevance to what's been going on as we all know. So I guess what I'd like to do, gentlemen, is if I could have each of you, and Chris, I'll put you on the spot if I may, but have each of you just explain a little bit about, what your current role is, what your former role is, how is that relevant to, the topic of the pandemic and healthcare in the pandemic. Give us a framing for, the perspective that you bring to this, and then we can move to Paul.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Fred, and thanks for having me. The problem that I've been interested in my entire career really is how we do better as a scientific, a medical community, and as a society at transforming the wonderful fundamental research which is done in the US and other countries into interventions which actually get to people and are shown to improve health. We spend a lot of time appropriately talking about scientific discovery, and we all love scientific discovery, myself included. But what I really love is making patients better. And I think we all know that the gulf between and the time between scientific discovery and getting an intervention developed, a drug, a device, a behavioral intervention, whatever it is, and getting it to all the patients who need it, that whole process currently takes at a minimum 30 years. And as Paul will talk about, can be infinite in some circumstances. And so that problem is called the translational problem. And the science behind this, the underlying principles by which this happens, how do we develop drugs, devices, behavioral interventions, sure they're useful and get them to everybody who needs them? How do we do that better? And what's interesting is that the limiting factors for essentially all diseases in developing therapeutics or other interventions and getting them to all the patients who need them are really the same across all diseases. And we tend to focus so much on individual diseases, and we understand that, individuals or have themselves or family members interested in a disease tend to approach it in a very narrow way, and they don't realize that we're going to make much more headway if we look at this as a common problem across all diseases. I mean, just imagine what the world would be like if instead of 30 years to infinity, it took 3 years. The life expectancy of even most of the most severe cancers or rare pediatric rare diseases. That's the life expectancy of the patient, and now it's nowhere near that. And I think as we'll talk about today, COVID-19 really, like a lot of stress tests, like a cardiac stress test in a patient, has shown up some rather uncomfortable realities that I think people like Paul and me have been dealing with for years, and are well known to certain of us. But I think for most people in society, they hadn't realized that these problems exist. And so the question I think we want to talk about today is not only what happened in COVID-19, because we did better in COVID-19, but how do we do everything we can to have society learn what we did together, and apply it to all the other diseases and all the other countries which are in just as great need as patients with COVID-19.
Yeah.
Paul, you've spent your career focusing on delivering healthcare. So you're sort of at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, from the research. Chris is in the middle on the translational side, trying to accelerate the research to the delivery side. Talk about what you've been doing, what you've been seeing in the context of the pandemic.
Well, first of all, let me just echo Chris by thanking you, Fred, for making this happen. When you talk about translation, that's really, we're on the other end of that pipeline, waiting for the products. And they usually come in one of three varieties: a preventive, like a vaccine, a diagnostic, or a therapeutic. There are others, but those are the main three.
Yep.
So the way to look at that pipeline is discovery science, which, I would say, although I'm not a, basic scientist, I would say that's where most of the real innovation comes from, discovery science. And the second D after discovery is development. And a lot of that is done by big pharma, biotech, sometimes through public institutions, but mostly not. And then finally delivery. And as you said, Fred, that's where I am, waiting for, the results. So if you look at a beta blocker after an MI, or you look at HIV after its identification as the cause of AIDS, it usually takes, as Chris said, many, many years and really decades to go from identification of the new problem to the deliverables, whether they're preventives, diagnostics, or therapeutics. But with COVID, in spite of our very poor performance in the United States in terms of the public health response, in spite of that, and I'm sure there are other folks in the UK and elsewhere, China, Russia, who feel similarly. The speed with which we went from identification of a new pathogen, or a pathogenic force for that matter, to having a deliverable that was really effective has been very substantially reduced. So even though we did a very mediocre job in the United States, we did a good job on vaccine development. And the basic science of the COVID response has really, once again, been a pillar that helps us move forward the diagnosis and delivery of the problems. So that's one thing that's worth saying. Now, if you look at other respiratory ailments, just take tuberculosis and look how many a completely treatable disease for which we don't have an effective vaccine, or not a very effective one, takes, we're talking about 10 million new diagnoses a year, whether they're made or not, and between 1.5 and 2 million deaths. So we know that we can do a mediocre job, not only in developing these tools, but in developing them over time. But we can also do a great job. And I think COVID is more in the latter category than the former. And I just want to say, you know, in terms of what I've been doing, as you might expect, since Partners in Health, and my day job is as a medical professor. So as a Harvard professor, I've been working a lot on COVID. But I really want to underline what Partners in Health has done, which has been to take the public health interventions that we knew about, such as social distancing, mask wearing, contact tracing, there's a long list, and apply those in Massachusetts, Newark, Chicago, obviously always with partners, Navajo Nation, parts of Florida, Phoenix even, you know, and try and chip in on the hard work between the identification of new problem and the identification of new tools that could halt it. So that's really what we've been doing. But I would like to, you know, just turn this back to you, Fred, by saying now going forward, you know, I'm looking at these vaccines and practically drooling, because here we are with, you know, an entirely new class of vaccines with, from what we can tell, almost no adverse side effects and very high efficacy against this novel pathogen. So I'm going to Rwanda tonight, and what I have in mind is, how do we get this vaccine manufactured on that continent? Because, you know, we know that big pharma can do amazing things, but we also know that, you know, just look at how many people have been vaccinated in places like Rwanda, which has a very effective, well-organized health system, and, you know, where the majority of vaccines have gone. So that's what's on my mind, looking at this wonderful shortening of the period between discovery and development and delivery.
That's great. Chris, just to keep on this optimistic note, because I know it's going to turn here soon,
Yes,
and
we are.
needs to turn. But
Yeah.
Talk about the science, talk about the process of the science. And you know, obviously you're much closer to it than I am. I've read certainly a fair amount, and you know, about how Dr. Carrico, I believe, had been working in obscurity for decades on mRNA as an idea, with very little uptake, until the uptake began to happen rather rapidly. But this seems like a miracle compared to most medical development. What you know, how these vaccines have come to market for COVID-19. Talk about that success. What made it work? You know, and how can we replicate that, or you know, can we replicate that going forward?
Yeah. Well, it gets to the question of why I'm here in my new post. I mean, I had a great gig at the NIH, and we were doing fantastic things. But as you heard from Paul, and as I think as most of you know, the companies that developed these vaccines were private sector companies, and one of them, Moderna, was birthed out of Flagship, which is the firm that I now am located in. And Flagship is a multi-company organization. So the company that I am CEO of is a very small company. It's about what Moderna was about 11 years ago, more of a glimmer in someone's eye. But it's a similar transformational idea, and the important thing about what's happened is that, as Paul mentioned, this was only possible due to years and years of basic fundamental research done mainly by NIH grantees, and then initially at the NIH, people like Barney Graham, who had been working on these problems for years, and then Moderna among them, with this crazy idea that one could deliver mRNA, which most folks listening probably have no idea what that is, but that's the messenger that goes between your gene and your protein, and it's basically viewed as it's a short-term, highly rapidly degraded messenger, which but the idea of giving that as a therapeutic was kind of nuts, frankly, and much less as a vaccine. But and so Moderna had been working on this for 10 years to actually actualize. How do we actually do that? And they had developed prototype vaccines for a number of neglected illnesses, and some of the smaller epidemics that we've seen in the last few years. But when COVID came around, you probably know these numbers, just astounding numbers, that within a month of having the sequence of this virus, Moderna and the NIH, who were working very closely together on this, had designed the mRNA that became the vaccine, and very rapidly went through all of the preclinical testing that's required and got into people around June, which, and if we think about the timelines here, which are roughly a year for COVID, the equivalent vaccines, if we look at Zika or others, that timeline a few years ago was about 3 years. If we go back earlier than that, it was more like 10 years or 20 years, and now we're down to a year, and that is a completely generalizable, we think, technology. But if you ask why it happened, in addition to the fundamental science, it was because a lot of the impediments, the non-scientific impediments, which prevent rapid progression of these therapeutics or vaccines from getting to people, getting through clinical trials and getting deployed, those decks were cleared by abundant funding from the federal government, among others, in this country, by regulators who worked very closely with the companies to get these evaluated, to show safety and efficacy as rapidly as possible. And there was then run into, and this is still what we're dealing with, what Paul was talking about, we ran into a production problem. That is that the world had never had the problem of trying to vaccinate the entire world's population, 8 billion people. You got to make 8 billion doses of something. When you think about MMR vaccine for children, there's a small number of children that get vaccinated every year, but there became quite limiting supply chains. So things as simple as the rubber stoppers that go in the glass vials into which the vaccine is put became so limiting that was the thing limiting vaccine production. And then the glass vials themselves became limiting. And then what happened, and Paul should speak to this, understandably, each individual company or country, was sort of every person for himself. And the U.S. made its deals, and the U.K. made their deals, and every country in Europe made their deal, and the wealthy countries made their deals. And there was a pool, which Paul should talk about, a pool through the WHO to supply vaccine to the small and the lower income countries of the world, but they were I shouldn't say an afterthought, because they certainly weren't from the people who were developing these, but the reality is that the vaccines went, the limited vaccine capacity, production capacity, went to the wealthier countries earlier, and now we're just beginning to see it in other countries. So the Moderna, the flagship company that I mentioned, and that a lot of you probably benefited from, I did. I got the Moderna vaccine. It has taken from the very beginning a quite progressive, in my view, approach to this, and saying proactively that they were not going to enforce their patents in a very large number of countries in the world who have fewer financial resources. And so it took the IP question, the patent question, off the table for those countries. But I think what most people don't appreciate is that while having freedom to operate from a IP perspective is really important, what remains limiting is production capacity. And if a country like Rwanda wanted to build a factory to make this mRNA vaccine, that would take a minimum 1.5 years and require a lot of money to do. So it's, in a way, it's a generic problem, right? I mean, where we see this over and over and over again, where the majority of the world's population is the afterthought for those of us who do therapeutic development. But in a way, it's a singular case. You know, I hope we will not again in our lifetime have an illness affecting the majority or potentially the entire world's population simultaneously. And that was the situation we were dealing with COVID-19. So it's quite a special case in some cases.
Paul, follow on that, those remarks from Chris about, and you are going to Rwanda tonight. You've mentioned in our sort of previous discussions that Rwanda has actually been remarkably successful in responding to COVID-19. And it sounds like that's not because they've got legions of scientists and factories up and running and pumping vaccine out into the streets. It sounds like it's a public health response. But talk to me about Rwanda. Why is it a good example from that perspective? And are there lessons that, frankly, places like the United States, Europe, and the other G20 countries can learn from Rwanda's healthcare response to this?
Thanks, Fred. And I just want to say, hearing Chris's assessment of what happened, my own analysis squares with that very handily. And I would just say that, you look at Rwanda, which is very, very helpful, I think, in thinking about the challenges that Moderna, Pfizer, all of the COVAX, the WHO supported endeavor that Chris mentioned. Everybody should be thinking about this right now, I think. I mean, you see what's happened with India, which is the leading producer of vaccines in the world today. They've been undone to some very significant extent by what's happening now. And they would be less undone, of course, if they had the deliverables that Chris is talking about. So if I go back to what Moderna said last fall, that they were not going to enforce the patent that they had. First of all, I just want to say, we don't have any experience with announcements like that, really, but it made a big difference to a lot of people who were thinking, how are we going to address what will be coming with this wonderful windfall of a new deliverable, in this case, a preventive, so quickly after the identification of a new pathogen. So what are we going to do? So we really, I actually went to a meeting in March at the latest at Harvard Medical School, where that's my day job as a medical professor. And I remember there were my friends who were working with Moderna, Pfizer. I wasn't even thinking of them as friends working with Moderna and Pfizer until, of course, COVID reminded us, hey, you better hope you have your academic friends also working in, again, delivery, which is going to involve diagnostics, preventives, and therapeutics. So I heard that in March, and I was sitting there listening to friends, and these are like, some of them I trained, actually. They're way better scientists, of course, but I trained them clinically. And there they were saying that we will have this vaccine developed in a month. I heard it with my own ears, and they did. So when we look at the challenge now, and the challenge that we would like big pharma, various regulatory agencies, international development organizations, et cetera, to take up, is can we really respond to a disease that may indeed have variants that will require booster shots? Can we respond without production capacity, on the continent of Africa and on other continents? I would say, based on my experience, which is, goes back some decades, the answer is no. We don't have any example of taking a new deliverable like this and making it broadly available within a few years. It's usually a few decades. And Chris's analysis squares with that. You know, we can go back case by case. When we discovered that a beta blocker, after acute MI was, an effective way to prevent death, how long did that take, to be taken up just in the United States, where one might argue the primary problem was not the lack of availability of a beta blocker. It took a long time, many, many years. So what we're trying to do right now is to work with big pharma, with the producers. People have come up with this amazing deliverable, but with the public health authorities in settings where we know they can get a lot done. Now, the reason I go back to Rwanda again and again is clearly they were at rock bottom in 1994. I mean, the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, probably the most awful, deadly event of the late 20th century. So, and it took me 10 years to confess publicly that from Haiti, fortunately, no one cared about my opinion about Rwanda. I'd never even been there. But like a lot of people watching, I thought it's going to take generations to recover from this. But it didn't. So we need to ask why Rwanda has done so well, going from the world's worst situation in terms of life expectancy, maternal mortality, et cetera, to, one of the most rapidly improving country in the world in terms of decreased rates of mortality. Those are the steepest declines in mortality ever documented at any time in any place. So why is that? And can we use what they've done to build out some manufacturing capacity that might not take a year and a half? Maybe it'd take a year, because that would already be a big shortening. Now, I think that's possible in Rwanda, for sure. I do. And I think other people are going to see that as well, and the question is, can we bring together enough of those partners? It's going to involve big pharma, particularly the companies that have developed mRNA technology. It's going to involve other companies. It's going to involve international development organizations and international development banks. Most of all, it's going to involve the public sector of Rwanda and those who have the technology. And I think, for us to fail to do this, especially in the middle of India's torture, would be just a terrible mistake, because we've just seen what can happen to the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines. And I'm not talking about COVID vaccines. I'm talking about all vaccines, the ones that we depend on. And, we really need to amp up our pressure to, look to the people who understand these technologies to help us amp up the production capacity in other places in the world. Now, again, am I an expert in this? No, I'm not. I'm an expert on that third D. You have the first D, which is Chris's D, discovery. But he also knows development. He knows both of those things much better than I do. But I do know a lot about delivery. And I am sure we can do this with the help from our partners in the first two Ds. But we're going to need a lot of help. Everybody's going to have to say, the third D is what concerns all of us. And we take too long to have an equity platform when we have these new developments. How can we shorten that? And I have to tell you, I've had nothing but positive support from the people I've talked to about this. That doesn't mean it's going to go through, but it should.
Yeah. And Fred, I just want to pick up on one of the points that Paul made, is that the third D, the delivery problem, the data are not great about the average delay from showing that something actually works, like a beta blocker for hypertension or an ACE inhibitor after for heart failure after an MI. But the number that's generally used is 15 to 17 years.
That's right.
And when you think about this as a doctor, which both Paul and I are, you can actually do the numbers of how many people die because our delivery system is so awful and is so bad at getting effective therapies to all the people who need them. And we've seen this in this country, of course, in minority communities, which have suffered disproportionately from COVID and had higher mortality rates, and their vaccination rates have lagged as well for acceptance reasons, among others. But it's also an access. It's also an access question. So one of the things that Paul said, I really want to second, which is that I found in my own career that the U.S. has a lot to learn from countries like Rwanda and Kenya, which, when you say this to a lot of people in this country, their heads explode, because they think, what can we possibly learn, from them? But they do delivery better than we do, and they do public health better than we do, and we can learn from them on this side, and we have these major problems in our country as well.
Mm-hmm. So help me think this through. There's sort of two major challenges here, right? One is you've got the discovery to delivery pipeline takes too long, right? For all kinds of reasons. We can go into that. You've already sort of alluded to a number of them, and maybe there's structural reasons or cultural reasons or whatever there are, but it's not that we don't have enough scientists working on this stuff, is my guess. I think that there are plenty of people doing the discovery bit. It's just that it takes a while to get there. So perhaps you now have some places in the world, Rwanda, Kenya, for example, who've adapted their public health delivery systems to deal with that handicap, if you will, and do very, very well. You've got it. So that's one thing to say, okay, you've got, the public health delivery side of it is critical. And I want to come back to that, because I think that's what we're going to be dealing with for a while. But is there any way to accelerate that pipeline from discovery to delivery? How do you do that? And what are the impediments to doing that? We've chatted about this earlier, but I don't think we've really sort of gotten into some of these, these challenges that you mentioned earlier, you alluded to. What are the challenges, and how do we, bypass them, break them down, fix them?
Yeah, so I'll talk about that a little bit, and then of course Paul should chime in. So the component of the NIH that I was director of for 10 years, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, was founded precisely to identify and overcome those roadblocks. And amazingly, it is the only institution in the world focused on this problem, which I still find astounding. I think because there's so little understanding of how this process works, and there is such a culture of just dealing with this dysfunctional, inefficient system we have, that there is no one focused squarely on how do we accelerate this process. And that's what NCATS was founded to do. And one can, and NCATS did, identify, worked out a map of this process. And it's an exceedingly complicated map. It looks like the worst board game you've ever seen in your life, with lots of recursive, loops that you can never get out of, whirlpools, various things. But it is once you have that map, we thought about it just like a Google map. There's some parts of that map that are green, some parts that are yellow, some parts that are red. And the red parts are the ones which are most limiting. And there are things like 9 times out of 10, when a drug goes into people for the first time, it never gets approved for any indication. So 90% of drugs that go into people for the first time fail. Why? Because most of the testing that was done before that is done in animals. And newsflash, rats are not humans. And we've finally begun to think about, this is really a limiting problem, right? So if you could work for 10 years on something, put it into humans for the first time, and it still fails 99 times out of 10. But there are ways around that. And that's the kind of thing that NCATS focused on. Just one other example, clinical trials, incredibly inefficient. There are good data that about half of trials that are started in people fail for what's called futility. That is that they work for years and years and years to try to get enough people in the trial to get a positive result, and then they can't get enough people recruited, so they can't do the experiment. They just give up, and that is 5 to 10 years sometimes of patients' time and effort, clinical investigators' times and effort, doctors' times and effort that is just wasted. It just doesn't go anywhere. And there are reasons for this. And one can identify what those reasons are, and develop workarounds. So just one very brief example, but it speaks to the point that when NCATS first started, if you're going to do a trial across 20 or 30 sites, which is very, very common these days for almost any disease, to get enough patients, simply the human subjects review at each institution, because it has to go through 20 or 30 sets of lawyers, all of whom have to agree on every period and semicolon, that could take 2 years. Yeah. 2 years to simply get through the system we have created just to supposedly protect people, human subject protection. And many people become ineligible for the trial or die waiting for us to get through that human subjects review. And NCATS solved that problem. Not by ourselves. We did it with a large consortium of academic health institutions. It was a big team effort, but it's now done. And there's now a treaty that 800 institutions have signed, and they can all rely on each other. And that review can now take, during COVID, some of those reviews took place in a week, not 2 years. So these are solvable problems, but one of the things that we always find, limits this is, and why I'm so grateful for you for doing this webinar, is that I find, and I know Paul finds, that most of the public has no idea that these are problems. They have no idea that they're solvable problems. Yeah. Because many of the problems we're talking about half of them are scientific problems, the really hard scientific problems, and Mother Nature is really stingy at giving up her secrets. So that, right. Those things we're working on too. But some of these things are human created. Yeah. It's the pogo thing. We've seen the problem, and it's us. And I know Paul and I feel very strongly that we have not only a scientific and a medical obligation to solve those and get around those problems, but we have a moral obligation. Let's just be clear. We have a moral obligation. If we know how to get around these problems and we don't do it, then that's a real indictment. And I think it's the kind of thinking that we're all doing post-COVID. We did some things more quickly in COVID, and why? And there's 6,999 other diseases out there, people dying. Just don't they deserve the same treatment? And that's it's an important lesson. And I know Paul and I are both hoping that this teachable moment, before people forget COVID, because they will, we know they will. We've seen it over and over and over again. Can we put in place the systems to overcome the forgetfulness that we know is going to come? So it's not dependent on the feeling of urgency on the part of the public. The systems are in place to have it happen despite the forgetfulness of the public.
Wow.
Paul, what do you think?
I'm so wound up about this because, again, as you see, we're agreeing very violently. When I look back over the last 15 months, and Chris has a different perspective, but I would be surprised if we're not reading this the same way. When I look back, I think, wow, we did not do a good job on the public health front. In fact, uniquely poorly. We also didn't do well on the clinical response, which shocked me, actually. You know, I worked on that. I work with some of the, I work in a big teaching hospital in Boston, the Brigham. And, I just know how hardworking my colleagues were, nurses, doctors. I was pretty shocked that we had case fatality rates as high as we did in the United States. Not particularly at the Brigham, but in New York, that's not what I really expected. I expected we would do very poorly on the public health. How could we not? For 100 years, we've invested so little. So on the public health front, we should have expected failure, and we got it. On the clinical front, I actually expected success, and we had a mixed bag. But where did we have a resounding success? In basic science and development of new tools. Mm-hmm. Not just the vaccines, also therapeutics and diagnostic. Yeah. And I'm sure there are many other countries that had enormous success in this arena, but the United States was a standout in its poor performance on the public health and clinical side. I don't know about clinical yet, but that's my worry. And a standout in its good performance on developing new tools. So when you look at NCATs, and when you look at, and this is my hope for Chris's next decade, when you look at where we could go and where we could speed things up, it's really, if we keep our pipelines open for that first D of discovery, I mean, it would be nutty for a country like ours to take our crown jewel, the NIH, the investments in basic science research from universities and the private sector. If we take that and muck it up, that would be a nightmare. So I think the Discovery Channel is actually working pretty well. Yes, there are burdensome regulatory requirements. Yeah, I mean, they can work that out in concert with those regulators. The development part, the second D, again, look at what Moderna and Pfizer did, and there are plenty of other, pharma agencies and biotech and med developers, right? I spent many years working on Ebola, and and mostly clinically, taking care of patients. But when you look back at the development, the discovery, the development and delivery, there were wonderful discoveries that were really basically already a vaccine, therapeutics, diagnostics. They were all on the shelf for a decade. Some developed by Americans, some developed by Canadians. But really the vaccine that we're using now, which is highly effective, it sat on the shelf for 10 years, or a variant did. So I'm just saying we need to be, and I believe this is probably why Chris is heading to Flagship. Yeah. We are pretty good at discovery. I say we as if I ever discovered anything. I'm a delivery guy. But as a collective, I think we need to recognize the power of our discovery science. And that should be true among the delivery people, the advocates, everybody in the world needs to understand, hey, there's a reason that we got from discovery of a new pathogen to discovery of a new preventive and therapeutics and diagnostics so quickly. And it's not on the delivery side. Like we delivery people can't claim any victory yet because we haven't succeeded clinically yet. So really our big chance now is to succeed clinically now, to succeed on diagnostics, and to succeed on preventives. And I'm just adding that because of those delays on the delivery side, one of the chief priorities of our scientific and medical world, including big pharma, should be how do we ramp up production for some of these tools in Africa particularly. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that's a big jump, but I think we can defend it. I think we can work together, to, again, what is the goal? It's to reduce the amount of time from the discovery science to delivery. And the delivery has to be a global consideration. Look at what we're looking at now with India, yeah, but the whole world. We have the great majority of vaccine doses delivered in less than 10 countries. Nobody wants that. I mean, Moderna doesn't want it, Pfizer doesn't want it, AstraZeneca doesn't want it, nobody wants it. So how do we shrink that? And I think that's where we are now. And Chris, I'm thrilled that you're going to Flagship.
Yeah, well, as Paul just described why I came to Flagship. because I agree completely with Paul. We still got work to do on the NIH side, on the discovery part and the science of translation, and to make all this work better, faster, cheaper. But I wanted to work on the side that Paul was describing, because that's really where the rubber hits the road. I have there's a saying that I was said to me by a mom of a rare disease patient a number of years ago that I think about almost every day, where we were talking about fundamental discovery. And she said, I love fundamental discovery for my daughter's disease. I love publications. It's great to see them. But when my daughter gets sick, I can't give her a publication.
Right.
And that crystallizes the problem for me. I can't give her a publication, and that is the province. Certainly, of the early part is the province of NIH, and certainly the province of NCATS, and actually the delivery, the science of the delivery, probably dissemination and implementation science, as it's often called, is the aspect of is an interest of NCATS as well. But compared to the investment that NIH and other government agencies in general have made in basic fundamental research, the amount of research that's gone into D&I, it's infinitesimally small.
Yeah.
Which and you get what you invest in, right? I mean, and so, but it's to some degree, I think it comes from the fact that people don't realize that this happens. I think there's a lot of magical thinking when it comes to the public, and they're thinking about where drugs come from, and you have a fundamental discovery, and there'll just be a drug within 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's what every newspaper article says, right? And so it just happens all by itself as the night follows the day. And if there's a drug or an intervention available or a vaccine, it'll just magically get to all the people who need it. Boy, wouldn't that be a nice world to live in? But it is the opposite.
Yeah.
And this was not the, what's interesting is I think it's to a degree, it's a generational thing. So if we go back to not just Paul and my generation, but the generation before us, fundamental science was really in its infancy. After World War I, after World War II, sorry, there was a covenant made between the NIH and the public that said, you support us, and we will discover the basic workings of the human body and understand how the human body works in health and disease as a basis to develop treatments for those diseases. And so for many years, it was very appropriate that NIH really focused on developing that knowledge base. But my read of this is that though we certainly don't know everything, for heaven's sake, we don't know everything, compared to when Paul and I were in medical school, this is unrecognizable on the scientific side. But if you ask, how different was your last visit to the doctor compared to 30 years ago? It's pretty much the same. I'm a neurologist by training. Neurology is basically the same as it was 35 years ago, even though the science has exploded. That is now, in my mind, that is the biomedical challenge for our era. It's the translation and the delivery side.
Amen is all I can say, Fred. If you started med school in the 80s, you got to see the most amazing explosion of discovery ever seen in any scientific arena.
Yeah.
And then you saw the development part work okay, right? In many instances, the ones we know about, and then the delivery. It was bad enough in the United States and Europe. It's like really bad in places in the world where there's not adequate resources to take this up in a fee-for-service manner or whatever the manner. And but that's where we are right now. We have a failure of delivery, and we need implementation science. And I don't expect the basic scientists I know to suddenly get more interested. They're already interested in delivery science. That's not what they do. Thank God they're working on the mechanisms that Chris mentioned. But, my experience and I'm all the other department chairs with one exception at Harvard, they're all basic scientists. I'm one of the only two who isn't. And I know from working with these people year in, year out for 10 years, that they're as gung-ho as I am in many ways about the delivery piece of it. They don't work on it, but they're gung-ho about it. So this is a structural problem. It's not really a cognitive problem or a discovery science problem. There are plenty of those, I've no doubt. But what we're seeing right now is the system isn't set up to help us, for that delivery part of it. And when we do, some people are expecting us to say things like, oh, we want less investment in basic science and more in delivery. Nobody I know believes that. I mean, some people do say that, but I mean, where's the pipeline coming from with the diagnostics, the therapeutics, the preventives? It's all basically from basic science. So there are many of us who are saying we need more basic science investments. Look at the return on that in the 20th century and 21st. But we really have to problematize, as graduate students say, the problem of delivery. Yeah. And, we have, especially in the United States, what else could explain our uniquely poor performance with COVID? It's not the lack of scientific knowledge. It's not the lack of conviction of the nurses and doctors. It's not the lack of goodwill. It's not the lack of people singing on their balconies in New York. It's that we have a system set up that can't do the work that we need. And that's a big problem in the United States. And it's a bigger, if different problem in many of the places we work. Not Rwanda, it was 15 years ago, but now Rwanda has addressed that by building out a national care delivery system and a national health insurance system. And I think one of their next contributions ought to be, hey, help us deliver these new or develop these new vaccines, especially if we're going to need to respond to new variants. Sorry, Fred, you didn't invite me to exalt. I
invited you to do exactly what you're doing. You're delivering. You're both delivering. This is what we want to see. So I think I get the technocratic problems, the structural problems. It's not on the discovery side. It's on the development side, maybe, but that can be fixed. Maybe that's a technocratic solution. And then there's the delivery side. Arguably, there's a technocratic solution. Let me take up another level of difficulty for you, though. And I'm going to read a question from someone that you'll recognize, Chris, because we roomed together in college. John McCarty says science data and public health have become increasingly more politicized at the level of the government and the public. This varies, of course, by countries and regions. What have we learned from COVID that can help these forces handicapping effective implementation of the 3Ds? So you had 3Ds, now I'm introducing the big nasty P. What do you think about that?
Oh boy, Paul, you want to take that one first?
No, I want you to take that first.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You got this one, Chris.
Well, all I can say is, having been right in the eye of the storm or the hurricane, whatever it was, during all of COVID, because I just left NIH a month ago. I can tell you that all of the storms or the political storms did buffet everyone at NIH, and there's no way it couldn't. But what was wonderful to see was at least in the circles that I ran in, and this is all the institute directors and all the people that Paul is referring to, who really kept their heads down. They knew what the priority was, and we were not going to get distracted from this circus going on outside, because we have sick patients, and our obligation is to them. And so as long as we stay laser focused on them, then you can tune out all the noise. And what was gratifying to see is that we were, for the most part, with rare exceptions, able to buffer a lot of the noise that was coming from the White House and Congress and all the usual players. And I think that's one of the reasons that the result was as good as it was in some ways, and not even worse than it was in other settings. Yeah, we live in this very strange, us versus them, society, which gosh, Paul knows more about than anybody, because tribalism is a disease of the human species, which I've dreamt for years of making a drug antagonist to whatever that gene is, and you can go into every meeting you had, you do
Please,
a fog room to prevent from behaving in these ways that they make up differences that are completely irrelevant, and then they're ready to kill each other over the differences. And it's just a disease that we as a species have, and that's what we're seeing now. And so I think, but one of the great things about medicine and science is that there's a ground truth. It's either true in science or it isn't.
Yeah.
And either the patient lives or they don't. Yeah. And politics, there's no such thing. You kind of make up your own truth. But as Paul knows, the patient gets better, he doesn't, or she doesn't. And that was been very salutary.
Very, very salutary.
Yeah.
It's just we're so lucky that we can at least go to that. I feel very ambivalent, Fred, saying that I'm disappointed by the clinical response, because again, we were all in it. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that when critically ill or injured people reach the Brigham, I think they do better, than any hospital that I've ever been to, and some of them I built in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. But so what's the problem if it wasn't in that, intubation proning kind of moment? Well, I'm just to give an example of what we always mean when we talk about structural problems, whether we're talking about racism, George Floyd, whatever. Let's just go back to public health. I mean, Massachusetts is a very blessed state. It has done well. It usually is a healthy state, highly educated, blah, blah, blah. But, there are 350 different local public health departments in Massachusetts. So think about that. And the reason I bring it up is because the governor of Massachusetts named Partners in Health as their partners to do contact tracing, which of course is only part of a major public health investment that has been forgotten in the narrative. One that we're very familiar with from Rwanda, even Sierra Leone and Liberia, because of Ebola, certainly Haiti, we learned this stuff there. Anyway, so, what do? You don't start attacking the beleaguered, underfunded public health departments in Massachusetts, and they're worse elsewhere. So, this is part of delivery science too, figuring out what is this messy, when we talk at NIH about mechanisms of disease, well, this is a mechanism of pathogenic outcome, and it's all social, all structural, all things that could be studied. And I'm not saying I push the NIH to study them. I'm saying there are other people who could do that and help us render a verdict on why we did so well in some arenas, again, vaccine development, diagnostics, even therapeutics, and why we did so poorly in others, delivery of services, outcomes, mortality, deaths. Yeah. So, we have a lot of accounting to do in the years going forward, a lot of deciphering. But, I think we can come out of this with some optimism, because in the end, I think what we're probably going to say is we failed in terms of the public health interventions. And that's one reason why you have such high death rates. But we didn't fail in terms of developing new preventive technologies. And those are going to stop the epidemic here.
Yeah. And I just want to make two points to Paul's points. One is that, to reflect a little bit, people are probably wondering, so what's up with the U.S. in the public health system? And, I think the flip side, in my mind, this is totally my opinion, but I guess that's what Paul and I are both doing. In my mind, the neglect, and let's just call it for what it is, the neglect of the public health system, I think, is to some degree at least a flip side of our love affair with technology. We love a shiny new object. We love a new drug. We love personalized medicine. But the fact is that the biggest improvements in health historically have always come at the public health level. And so as the US has gotten more and more excited about my disease, which I'm not saying this is a good thing in some ways, the medicine now allows it. And actually the company that I'm running at Flagship is partially oriented around this issue, but we run the risk of getting so excited about the technology that and its implications for me that we lose track of what really counts, which is how are we doing on a population level? I mean, individuals are, of course, all the individuals together make up the population, right? So they're right. In some ways flip sides of each other. But I do worry that we do want to maintain this preeminence in basic research and mechanistic research and technological development and all those good things. But we have to rediscover the coolness, and I mean that in a social way. Making people better is really cool. It's not just having a shiny new object. And we got to make it cool again. And public health, to me, even though I'm a technical guy, I'm also a public health guy. And I think public health is even cooler than the shiny new object.
Yeah. I just think, Fred, that, if we can avoid the trap of either or, the tyranny of the either or.
Yeah, which is,
it's like we don't have the deliverables without the discovery science.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But we do a really crappy job on delivery, which is something we could fix, right?
Yeah.
Not by divesting from the basic science work, but even the current administration right now, it looks like that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. They're not saying let's reduce our initiative on basic science research. They see as well as we do that's what gave us the vaccines and the therapeutics and the diagnostics. So they get that. But what are they pushing for? They're saying we have a broken or non-existent safety net, right? And everything from the, I'm just so uplifted by the fact that they're not going after the basic science funding to divert it, but rather saying, you know what, we can do this. And someone named Gracie Stoddard asked a question in the chat about PEPFAR, which was George Bush's plans to respond to AIDS, not just prevention, but prevention and taking care of people on the continent of Africa. So PEPFAR means President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And I remember when they were thinking about this, first of all, I was very surprised to be invited to comment on it. But I said, hey, this is what a patient looks like before. These were Haitian patients. This is what it looks like after. Of course, we can do that delivery in a rural area. It doesn't require electrophoresis, It's like you give people a pill. It's not surgical. And that's what happened. And I remember this moment. Actually, Anthony Fauci, since it's not a secret anymore, is the person who sent me to the White House. And I said to him, really? You think they'll let me in there? And they did. And it was great because, just saying, hey, this is what a patient who's dying of AIDS and tuberculosis looks like. And this is when you say, stop dying already. Here's the therapy for both those diseases.
Yeah.
And what they said that day as they were elaborating this, and President Bush made this clear, he said he called it new money. I had no idea what that meant. What does new money mean?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that is a very specific meaning.
It's a very specific meaning. And I didn't know. I thought money is money. It's fungible, but it's entirely significant. It was new money for AIDS therapy in Africa. And it was a lot of new money. And it saved like 15 million lives already. And that's not even counting the children who never got HIV because they had proper preventive care. So, you know, to Gracie Stoddard's question, I think that's exactly the kind of thing we need. We need new money. We could never take it away from either basic science discovery, and whether that's done by NIH or a university or big pharma, whatever, we can't do that. That's our insurance for the future, right? I think development has some problems, of course, right? Because the burden of disease and the gaps in what we have should dictate to some extent what gets developed by big pharma or other developers, right? We've got a long way to go there. But I mean, I think on delivery, as a nation, that's where we've got to put some more attention, right? And, you know, look, we've been doing okay on delivery of the vaccine. I mean, it's not perfect, but inside the United States. And then when we think globally, then we can say, okay, we're doing okay here. What's our plan in Rwanda, in Malawi, in Lesotho, in Nigeria, in India, in Europe for that matter?
Yeah, let me hop on that, because, you know, I think, look, there's two aspects to the global situation here, right? One, which we've already addressed very eloquently, both of you, is simply, you know, morality. It's equity, right? It's like, how come the rich people of the world get to live and the poor people get to die? For something that we could arguably fix and stop them from doing. We could prevent them from getting it. We could cure them once they've got it, whatever. So there's the moral equity argument, which is never going away, and that's critically important and perhaps most important. The other aspect, though, that I think this pandemic in particular raised in my mind, and I'm not alone, I don't think, is the fact that given what's happening with the globe, with development, given how connected we are in all elements of the globe, given how quick it is to fly from one end of the globe to the other, given the fact that human growth, population growth, economic pressures, and climate change are all sort of interacting to push more and more humans into what used to be wilderness environments, where all kinds of interesting little zootropic, animal-based pathogens may be bumping around, you know, and then, you know, they bite you or you eat them and you get it, and wham, bang, we've got another, pandemic. It strikes me that it's a selfish interest for us to try and fix this on a global basis as well, because if we don't, we're setting ourselves up for the next thing. And God forbid we have something as infectious as COVID-19 that doesn't respond to mRNA technology, right? I mean, talk to me a little bit about that. Talk to me about, you know, how we can coordinate on a global basis. What do we need to do that to try and, you know, prepare for the next thing, whatever that thing might be?
Well, Chris, something tells me you're going to turf that to me anyway. I'm just gonna say something that I hope the listeners will remember. HSS. What a terrible thing to have to use an acronym to describe health system strengthening. But it's worth it. It's so unsexy and uninteresting. It's definitely not mechanistic in the sense of an NIH proposal. But without a health system to deliver whatever the deliverables are, again, we're talking here today about preventative diagnostics and therapeutics. Without that, you know, you see what we saw in responding to Ebola in Upper West Africa in 2014 and 2015 and 2016. You know, you basically have to pull in the staff, the stuff, the space, the systems, and open up the health system. And that is, you know, that is not only not sexy and not a mechanism and never going to receive NIH funding, which, you know, there ought to be other ways of funding it, but that's really what we have to do to respond to zoonoses. A lot of people are talking about we need a better surveillance system. We have to have, you know, things in forests around Central Africa, Asia, whatever. You know, influenza is thought to have come from Kansas, you know, the influenza strain of 1919. So wherever it is, hey, I'm all for that stuff too. It's fine. But that's not that's like having basic science research without delivery too. Having a surveillance system without any means of, I mean, that's basically been rejected by the victims of colonial rule, because that's what they got. They didn't have care. They didn't get, therapy. What they got was disease surveillance, and particularly of, livestock and other things that were valuable to the colonial rulers. The labor, they wanted to protect the labor force, whatever their reasons were. We don't need to know. We just know that they were, I mean, just to give an example, the British were in Sierra Leone for 200 years. They built all of 0 medical schools and 0 nursing schools before they left in the 1960s. I mean, that kind of says it all, right? So we need to build out those health systems. And people like me, we're saying, okay, we'll do that. As long as people like Chris are pumping new developments into the system, right? As long as the Tony Fauci's of the world and the basic science researchers who are unknown, who are, doing their work in their labs, if they keep up with their job, then our job has to include health system strengthening. And we should stop having to beg for that. I mean, if anything would make you want to say, all right, I'm done begging for resources so that we can help protect the world, it might be a pandemic like this. I'm not that close to saying that, but it is wildly irritating to have to beg to say, hey, let us protect you. It's not irritating to me because I actually like the work, but I mean, it's nutty that we're not, investing in the health system strengthening part when we know that all the surveillance in the world is not going to deliver a good result when something is airborne or spread from person to person like Ebola, airborne like COVID. Without a healthcare system, who's going to go in for supportive isolation and stop the chain of transmission of either disease? And the answer is one that we know already. You have to have, if you're going to have good disease control, you have to have good disease care. So I'm going to say HSS, and I want people who are basic scientists to remember that means health system strengthening. Like we'll do the work, but we have to have support.
Yeah, and I just want to point out something that I learned and NIH learned to our chagrin during COVID-19 too, which is that despite the amazing academic health systems that we have in this country, including Harvard, but there are 100 some odd large academic health centers in this country. And when I was at NCATS, I ran the largest of them as a network of 60 of these of all the famous institutions, and we tied them all together in a network for translational medicine, and it really made a huge difference during COVID. But what we discovered was that the incentive systems within those academic health systems are such that actually doing rapid, effective, collaborative, multi-site clinical trials to address problems like COVID, despite everybody having the best of intentions and working really hard, just did not deliver. And actually, the best recruiting sites that we had in our trials, and they were typical, were the satellite sites of the academic centers. So like in Texas is my favorite example. The UT Houston has many people obviously in Houston who had, but there was a particularly, they were having trouble recruiting for these COVID trials. And there's a lot of reasons for this. A lot of it has to do with academic incentives and people fighting over patients and various things. And so they have a hub and spoke system where they have a whole bunch of other community hospitals associated with UT Houston. And so he sent, is David McPherson is his name, you should know. He said, look, this is ridiculous. We're going to send our research capacity to these community hospitals who don't have research infrastructure and get them go. And they were our best recruiting sites. And so I think what it caused at the NIH is a long overdue, in my view, re-examination where do NIH's dollars go? I mean, we certainly need to support the large academic health centers, but to do this kind of work, we need to have research in the community as well, because that's where patients go, and we just have not done that well. Now compare this with the UK, that did a trial you all heard of called Recovery, which is the one that came up with the findings on hydroxychloroquine and dexamethasone and IL-6 antagonists and a bunch of other ones. That trial was done in an amazingly efficient, effective way for a cost between 1% and 10% of what we pay in the United States for a poorer outcome. I mean, that, Paul, you will love this. I managed to squeeze the number out of one of their PIs of what the per patient cost was in recovery. It's about $250 per patient. Yeah. In the United States, it's typically $25,000 a patient in a clinical trial, and often they're more expensive than that. And the outcome of recovery speaks for itself, and the NIH or the US underperformed. So this is another example of what we've been talking about for the last hour and some minutes, which is that these are eminently solvable problems because they were systems that we human beings created, right? I mean, so there's a lot of problems that Mother Nature created, or the SARS-CoV-2 virus created. Those are harder to control, but these are totally within our control, and so it's a matter of will. Where it's not a can't do it, it's a won't do it. And that's what I'm hoping your listeners will go away with a renewed sense of commitment to cause the kind of realignment, let's just call it what it is, to address the needs and the possibilities.
Since we're talking with presumably including some social scientists, I would go even farther, Chris. I would say there's not a lot of evidence so far that the very striking variation in case fatality, I could go just compare the United States to Rwanda, which has had very few cases, but also very low death rates, even with age-matched controls from what I can see now. Variations in case fatality, there's not a lot of evidence that those are biologically grounded, right? They're much more likely to be related to, delays in diagnosis, the structure of the system, the failures of the health insurance programs, the referral networks. I had a hard time in the spring getting a COVID test, even though I was working on the response. I'll just say it. The first COVID test I ever got was in Rwanda at the airport, and I got the results a couple hours later, PCR. And my point is,
I want your listeners to just capture that.
It's great.
It's just it's great. A microcosm of both the problem and how dare I say it, easy the solution is. It's not a can't. It's a won't. It's astounding.
At one other example is there was a curfew imposed in Rwanda. It was 9 o'clock, and I was seeing a patient actually, and there was an accident in the street, and that's pretty rare in Rwanda. There's very they enforce the traffic regulations. Every motorcycle driver has a helmet. You go over 5 minutes over the speed limit, you'll get stopped. Anyway, a friend was driving me, and I stopped in this, violent, fortunately not deadly accident, a lot of blood. Anyway, and I was covered with blood actually. And I still got stopped because I had been out after, it was like 9:10. Let's hurry and get back before the curfew. And as soon as they saw the blood on me, they said, okay, fine. I'm sure you're telling the truth. But I'm just pointing out, I never saw that kind of strict adhesion to some of the rules, and I'm from Florida, and I love Florida. But don't expect to see, the same kind of adherence to the rules here. So what are those are the cultural differences that are important, right? And this is back to Chris's point. I'm just saying, I think that this is for the social lens, I think that the social inequalities and let's just say the virulence of our social conditions are the most important determinant of these variations as far as we can tell right now.
Yeah.
And that's pretty difficult to say when you realize that we have so many more things in the United States than they have in Rwanda. We have, basically compared to them, an unlimited menu, but the way we're using it is not very effective. We're using it effectively in basic science, I would say, but on delivery,
I think that's true.
we get a C- at best.
Social comorbidities.
Yeah.
Right? Behavioral comorbidities more than anything. It seems to be a great deal of source of it. This is great. Are we better prepared? Have we learned? Are we still learning? Are the lessons, as you said, Chris, earlier, are we already beginning to forget? Are we better prepared? What do you worry about? Let me reframe it that way.
Gosh, I'm an eternal optimist, or else I wouldn't be in this business. but history is not encouraging, and it's not encouraging because human beings have an amazing ability to forget things they should remember because they're unpleasant. And I'll quote the famous Dr. Paul Farmer, which I remember I heard, Paul, you said this when you were at the NIH a few years ago, and it stuck in my head. Humans are also very good at getting used to almost anything.
Yeah.
Conditions that they should be outraged at, they get used to it and they get complacent. And it's another, along with tribalism, it's another disease of the human condition. And I worry that there is going to be a regression, as there has always been in the past, to another exigency. And of course, our 24-hour news cycle and social media and all that, we're seeing it already. How many headlines do you see about COVID-19 these days? Not so many. The circus has moved on, and it's going to be focusing on something else. And so I would like to think that our systems will be better prepared next time. But and certainly the NIH, I know, is doing a lot of soul searching and science searching about what it should do to be prepared for this. But as a society, I'm worried. I'm concerned.
Well, Fred, I want to cheer Chris up because we need him, to do his thing. I'm sure I did say that at the NIH because it's just such a troubling phenomenon that, we forget everything. Yeah. Maybe that's also adaptive. I'm sure there are biologists who would, but I'm an optimist as well, and for similar reasons, probably constitutionally.
Yes.
But I also may need it.
It's all genetics. It's all genetics.
It's all genetic. I need it to survive my everyday life.
You're right. That's right. You wouldn't have survived Harvard so long.
I can't get through the day without being optimistic. But I would say this. The reason I'm optimistic, there are two things. One is because of the pipeline of basic science.
Yes, and that is true. Yes, that's absolutely, yeah.
So, and I'm frustrated with it. Like in tuberculosis, to wait for 40 years for any new therapeutic agents, bad, when it's the leading infectious killer of adults in the world before COVID. So yeah, it's bad. But again, finally, there were 2 new agents after 40 years, right? Mm-hmm. And then with COVID, I think we're seeing stunningly rapid progress. So I'm just saying, one reason I'm optimistic, and I'm also worried, Chris, but I'm optimistic, is the pipeline of basic science.
Mhm.
And I want it to be used correctly by development, the second D by pharma.
Mhm.
But that basic pipeline, that pipeline is there. And we saw what a difference it made, even after our faltering public health and clinical response.
Yeah.
The second reason is, look, I don't dispute your diagnosis, Chris. People forget history and it's so painful, right? But, you know, I look at what happened with George Floyd,
Mhm.
you know, it was those 9 minutes, you see, they galvanized the largest protest in the history of the country, probably. So I'm just saying it's out there, right?
Yeah.
That we need a spark, not to galvanize protests, although those were great and uplifting. We need a spark to improve our social circumstances so that the promises of discovery science get translated into delivery. And what we need most is an equity platform. And that's why Chris and I are together today, and why you brought us together, Fred, is to talk about, we really do need an equity platform. What should it look like? And I don't know how we're going to answer that, but I feel like we're in the middle of a national and global ferment right now, where we're going to have to answer that question a little bit better than we have in the past. So I'm optimistic. Things are getting,
Excellent.
we have new
Excellent.
technologies, new awareness. We can mess that up, of course, but I'm gonna bet on improvement.
Well, that is a great note to end this webinar on. Thank you both so much, Paul and Chris, for joining us. This has been fantastic, illuminating, amazing, and we really appreciate both of you taking time out of your very busy days. You should be curing these things. Go work. Go do your stuff. Stop this stuff.
We will.
What are you doing on a webinar? It's a bad use of your time. But no, actually, it's a good use, because you're educating people. And certainly, if I'm anything like the cross section of our audience, you've told me a lot of things I had no idea about. And this is really important, because I think the next leg of this race is up to society and people like us to start making the changes that can enable that pipeline to actually get into the arms and the bodies of the people who need it down the road. So again, thank you so much. I know I could go on for hours. I'm sure many of our audience could, but I know you do actually have work to do. So I'm going to let you both go. Thank you everyone for joining us and staying with us. This has been great. We do more of these things, not often as good as this one, but if you'd like to stay in tune and in touch with us, find out what's going on, you can always go to our website. But again, thank you so much, Chris and Paul. This has been terrific.
Thanks,
And really appreciate it. And thank you for all your hard work, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
It's been an honor to be here. Thank you.
Real pleasure. And Chris, I'll see you in Boston.
Yeah, indeed. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Fred. Thank the
Thanks, Fred.
NISS. Thank you all.
Sure.
Thank you all.
Bye.